The executive slowly turned toward him. "There certainly is." His voice remained calm, but every crew member noticed the change in his expression. Only moments earlier, he had walked aboard expecting a routine operational delay. Now he understood something far more serious had unfolded. The flight attendants quietly lowered their eyes. Ground staff, standing near the entrance, stopped speaking. Altogether, Marcus remained seated. "There will be time for explanations." The executive nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir." That single word echoed through the cabin. "Sir." Several passengers exchanged startled looks. The captain's confidence weakened almost instantly. He glanced at Marcus again, noticing details he had ignored before, not expensive clothing or jewelry, but the quiet assurance of someone who never needed to prove his place for the first time since boarding began. Uncertainty reached the captain's face. Whatever relationship existed between this quiet passenger and the airline's highest executive, it was clearly nothing he had imagined, and everyone on board felt the balance beginning to shift. The quiet shift in the cabin did not escape the captain, but he misunderstood it completely. Seeing the chief operations officer standing only a few feet away, he convinced himself the airline's leadership had arrived to support his decision. He straightened his uniform, lifted his chin, and spoke with renewed confidence. "Sir, thank you for coming. This passenger refused to follow instructions, so I delayed departure until the matter could be resolved." The executive remained silent, mistaking that silence for agreement. The captain continued, "I acted according to company policy. Passenger safety and cabin security come first." Marcus watched without interruption. The executive finally asked, "Did you verify the passenger manifest before confronting him?" The captain hesitated for only a moment. There wasn't time. A flight attendant quietly lowered her eyes. "There was time," she whispered. The captain looked at her sharply. She swallowed. "I said the manifest was available." No one defended the captain. The businessman who had supported him earlier folded his arms and looked toward the window instead. Another passenger quietly said, "Checking a name takes less than a minute." His wife nodded. It could have prevented all of this. The captain noticed the growing distance around him. Only minutes earlier, approving glances had followed every order he gave. Now, faces that once reflected confidence showed doubt instead. The executive's expression remained unreadable. "I see," he said calmly. Those two words carried no praise, no reassurance, only disappointment. The captain suddenly realized he was explaining himself instead of leading the situation across the cabin. Crew members avoided meeting his eyes. No one rushed to stand beside him. The authority he believed would protect him was beginning to feel painfully fragile, while Marcus remained silent, allowing the truth to speak louder than any argument ever could. The captain's explanation faded into another uneasy silence. No one seemed interested in defending procedure anymore. Every eye followed the chief operations officer, waiting for his next move. Instead of addressing the captain again, he turned back toward Marcus with visible respect. He took one slow step closer. "Mr. Ellison." Marcus met his gaze. The executive lowered his voice. "Sir, may we speak privately?" The request stunned the cabin. A passenger near the front whispered, "Did he just call him sir?" Another answered twice. The captain looked from Marcus to the executive, struggling to understand why the airline's highest-ranking officer seemed almost uncomfortable standing before the quiet man he had dismissed. Only moments earlier, Marcus remained calm. "What? Would we discuss privately?" The executive hesitated. "I believe this situation deserves a conversation away from the passengers." Marcus studied his expression for a moment. The executive was not trying to hide the truth. He was trying to contain the damage. Behind them, two flight attendants exchanged worried glances. One quietly murmured, "He knows." The other nodded. "He knows exactly who Mr. Ellison is." Those words never reached the captain, but the fear in their voices was impossible to miss. Several passengers tightened their grip on their phones, no longer recording out of curiosity, but out of disbelief. Nothing about this scene made sense anymore. The man in the hoodie was being addressed with more respect than anyone else aboard. The executive stood patiently, waiting for Marcus's response. He made no demands, issued no functions, simply waited. The captain had never seen anyone from corporate behave that way toward an ordinary traveler for the first time. A troubling question entered his mind. What if the passenger he had judged by appearance was someone whose authority reached far beyond the cockpit? The answer hovered in the silence, waiting to be spoken aloud. The unanswered question lingered over the cabin as every passenger waited for Marcus to respond. The chief operations officer remained still, hoping a private conversation might prevent the situation from growing worse. Instead, Marcus quietly looked around the aircraft before returning his attention to the executive. "No," the single word landed gently, yet nobody mistook its meaning. The executive nodded slightly. "Understand." Marcus spoke with the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. "Let's finish this right here." The cabin fell completely silent. Even the captain stopped trying to defend himself. Marcus continued, "If this conversation only happens behind closed doors, nothing truly changes." The executive lowered his eyes. "You're right. This didn't happen in private." "No, sir." "Then it shouldn't be resolved in private either." Several passengers slowly lowered their phones, realizing they were witnessing something much larger than a disagreement over a seat. Marcus looked toward the flight attendants. "None of you should feel pressured to protect anyone from the truth." One attendant quietly whispered, "Thank you." The captain finally found his voice. "You're making this bigger than it is." Marcus turned toward him. "No, I'm refusing to make it smaller." The words settled heavily across the cabin. No anger, no insults, only quiet certainty. The executive took a careful breath. "Mr. Ellison, whatever happens next, I accept full responsibility for ensuring it is handled properly." Marcus gave a respectful nod. "That's all I've asked for since this began." The captain looked around the aircraft. No one appeared eager to support him anymore. Crew members stood in thoughtful silence. Passengers avoided meeting his eyes. Without raising his voice or revealing his position, Marcus had shifted the entire conversation away from authority and toward accountability. The truth no longer needed permission to enter the room. It was already sitting in the front row, waiting patiently for everyone else to acknowledge it. Marcus's final words settled over the cabin with remarkable calm. No one interrupted. No one reached for another excuse. The silence itself had become impossible to ignore. Every passenger sensed that the next few moments would reveal something far greater than a dispute over a first-class seat. The chief operations officer slowly faced the captain. "Captain, I need to ask you one question." The captain cleared his throat. "Go ahead." "Did you remove this passenger based on verified company policy or your personal judgment?" The question hung in the air. The captain searched for an immediate answer but found none. "I believed I was protecting the flight." The executive nodded slowly. "That wasn't my question." No one moved. Even the cabin crew remained perfectly still. A young flight attendant quietly stepped beside the executive and handed him the passenger manifest. "Checked it earlier," she said. Softly, he accepted the tablet without looking. Away from the captain, across the aisle, passengers who had been recording lowered their voices. "This is getting serious." "I think it already is." Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered with confidence. Anymore, the captain noticed every pair of eyes turning toward him instead of Marcus. For the first time that morning, he felt completely exposed. Marcus stayed seated beside Maya. Saying nothing, he understood that truth rarely needed to be pushed. It only needed space. The executive glanced at the manifest, then closed it without a word. His expression alone told the crew everything. One attendant quietly covered her mouth. Another looked down at the floor without a single announcement. The atmosphere changed. Respect was no longer attached to rank or uniform. It followed honesty. The captain's authority remained visible in his uniform, but its influence had quietly faded across the cabin. Silence no longer protected power. It protected accountability. And everyone aboard could feel the balance shifting toward a truth that was finally impossible to ignore. The quiet weight of accountability settled over the cabin without anyone needing to announce it. The chief operations officer remained composed. The crew stood motionless, and Marcus continued protecting Maya's peace instead of demanding attention. Yet the captain felt something changing that no policy or rank could stop. He looked toward his first officer, expecting reassurance. None came. The younger pilot kept his eyes lowered. The captain turned to the senior flight attendant. "We're ready to continue boarding," she hesitated. "Double quotes, sir. I think we should wait." Her careful response struck harder than any accusation. Only minutes earlier, she had followed every instruction without question. Now she no longer sounded certain. The captain glanced across the cabin. The businessman who had defended him refused to meet his eyes. The elderly passenger quietly folded his hands and looked toward Marcus. Instead, even the passengers who had remained silent now seemed to understand where their respect belonged. No one applauded, no one celebrated. They simply stepped back from the captain without taking a single physical step. He felt it. Authority still rested on his shoulders, but trust had quietly slipped away. His voice softened. "I was only trying to do my job," Marcus answered with the same calm dignity. "Doing your job begins with seeing the person in front of you." The captain lowered his head for the first time. He replayed the moment he had approached seat 1A. He realized he had questioned Marcus before checking a single fact. He had judged first, verified later. That truth echoed louder than every command he had given. Around the cabin, nobody rushed to condemn him. Their silence carried something far heavier than anger. Disappointment, as the captain stood surrounded by people who no longer looked to him for certainty. He understood that confidence had abandoned him long before anyone had formally accused him of doing anything wrong. The realization settled over the captain long after the aircraft had been grounded. What began as a confrontation inside one cabin was now spreading far beyond the terminal. Investigators reviewed reports, executives answered difficult questions, and old records surfaced from places nobody expected to revisit. Yet the most powerful evidence did not come from documents. It came from people. An elderly black veteran sat quietly in his living room as a television replayed footage from the Christmas flight. His hands trembled slightly. "I remember him," he whispered. His daughter looked over the pilot. The veteran nodded. "3 years ago, what happened?" "I filed a complaint." He stared at the screen. "He treated me like I didn't belong there." His daughter frowned, and nobody listened. The veteran gave a tired smile. They said it was probably a misunderstanding. Across the country, a respected Muslim doctor watched the same broadcast between appointments. The moment she saw the captain's face, old memories returned. A colleague noticed her expression. "Are you okay?" She hesitated. "That's the man," I reported. "What for?" She looked away. "He questioned whether I should be sitting in business class. Then he treated me like a security concern for the entire flight." Did the company investigate? They said there wasn't enough evidence. Meanwhile, a Hispanic family gathered around a kitchen table. The father muted the television. That's him. His teenage son immediately understood the airport incident. The father nodded. They acted like we were causing trouble just for asking questions. His wife sighed. I knew we weren't imagining it. For years, each story had existed alone. Separate complaints, separate disappointments, separate people. Told the same thing. Misunderstanding, miscommunication, no evidence. Now investigators placed the reports side by side. Patterns emerged, dates matched, descriptions aligned. The language was different, but the experience was painfully familiar. Back at company headquarters, staff members quietly reviewed testimony that should have received attention years earlier. No dramatic discovery changed. Everything, only repetition. The same concerns, the same warnings, the same outcome as forgotten voices finally found one another. A larger truth became impossible to ignore. None of these people had been believed when they stood alone. Together, however, their stories formed a picture too clear for anyone to dismiss. And the investigation continued moving forward. The investigation continued gathering momentum as forgotten testimonies reached the public. What had once been dismissed as isolated misunderstandings now formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. While executives reviewed documents behind closed doors, another group quietly decided it was finally time to speak. Several current and former crew members agreed to confidential interviews. Their names remained hidden, and their faces were never shown. They were not seeking attention. They simply wanted the truth to reach people who had never seen what happened behind the polished image of a luxury airline. One former flight attendant spoke first. We were taught to treat every passenger with respect. She paused. But sometimes that rule changed depending on who the passenger was. The interviewer asked gently, "What do you mean?" There were moments when appearance influenced decisions before policies did. Another crew member added, certain passengers were questioned more often. Others received the benefit of the doubt without being asked anything. No anger filled their voices, only disappointment. A retired cabin supervisor quietly admitted, I raised concerns years ago. What happened? I was told not to create unnecessary problems. The room fell silent. Another anonymous employee described subtle practices that had become routine. Sometimes seating decisions were enforced differently. Were those written policies? No. What were they? Habits. Current employees also began speaking through confidential statements reviewed by investigators. They described uncomfortable jokes made during layovers, unequal treatment during passenger disputes, and repeated moments when complaints disappeared before reaching senior leadership. One statement read, the problem wasn't only one person's behavior. The problem was how many people learned to stay quiet. That sentence spread quickly across news broadcasts and online discussions. Viewers noticed the same pattern in every interview. Nobody shouted, nobody demanded revenge. Each witness simply described what they had seen, allowing calm honesty to carry the weight of their experiences. As more testimonies emerged, public attention shifted beyond one Christmas flight. The conversation was no longer about a single captain or one passenger. It had become a wider examination of workplace culture, accountability, and the quiet choices that allow unfair treatment to continue when good people decide that the board chair looked around the room before speaking. We're on the record. The words settled over the long table as camera lights blinked outside the glass walls. Reporters waited in silence while directors, attorneys, and senior executives took their seats. No one reached for casual conversation. The Christmas flight had become too public for private solutions. The chief operations officer stood. What began as a passenger dispute is now a formal review of company conduct. No one objected. The pilot entered moments later. His uniform was pressed, his shoulders straight, and his expression carefully controlled. He nodded toward the board. I've served this airline for 22 years. The chair answered quietly. Today we're here to examine decisions, not years. The pilot sat. I followed procedure. A screen lowered from the ceiling. The first recording began. Passengers watched in silence as the pilot's own voice echoed through the room. "Those seats aren't for people like you." The recording stopped. Nobody spoke. Another video appeared from a different passenger. Marcus remained calm. Maya held her stuffed reindeer. The pilot grew louder. The room stayed silent until the chair asked, "Did you verify the manifest before making that statement?" The pilot hesitated. "No." Another file appeared. Airport security audio, a timestamp crew communications. Then, an investigator placed several worn HR folders on the table. These complaints spanned 7 years. The pilot frowned. "I don't remember those. You signed responses to each one." One written statement came from an elderly veteran. Another belonged to a Muslim physician. Another described a Hispanic family leaving a flight in tears. The investigator spoke gently. Different passengers, similar experiences. The pilot lowered his eyes. "I never intended—" The chair interrupted softly. "Intent matters." She paused. "So do patterns." No one defended him. No one argued with the evidence. The room became painfully still as forgotten voices finally received the attention they had sought for years. Outside, cameras continued waiting, but inside, the truth no longer needed headlines to make itself impossible to ignore. The final report remained open on the table, but no one reached for it. The evidence had already spoken more clearly than another page ever could. Across the room, the pilot stared at his folded hands. For the first time since entering the hearing, they were trembling. A board member quietly closed a folder. "We've reviewed every statement." Another director looked toward the pilot. "Is there anything you wish to add?" He lifted his head, searching familiar faces for reassurance. None appeared. Colleagues who had once praised his professionalism now avoided eye contact. The executives, who had defended him in private meetings, sat in complete silence. Even the reporters behind the glass lowered their notebooks. Sensing that the room had reached a turning point no headline could improve, the pilot swallowed. His voice failed. The chair waited patiently. "No one is rushing you." He nodded slowly. "I didn't think." The unfinished sentence lingered. Marcus watched quietly. The pilot tried again. "I didn't think he belonged there." No one interrupted. "I saw his clothes before I saw the passenger manifest." His shoulders sagged. "I convinced myself I already knew the truth." The confession echoed through the room, not because it was loud, because it explained everything. One director quietly asked, "And the earlier complaints?" The pilot closed his eyes. "I told myself each one was different, but they weren't." "No." Another long silence followed. The chair turned toward Marcus. Double quotes, "Mr. Ellison, would you like to respond?" Every face in the room shifted toward him. Marcus remained calm. He looked at the pilot. Then, at the board members who had finally chosen to listen, he spoke only one word. "Exactly." Nothing. Followed no speech, no celebration, no celebration. Anger. The single answer settled over the hearing with quiet certainty. The pilot lowered his head. For the first time, he understood that the greatest damage had not been caused by one sentence on one flight. It had come from years of believing assumptions could replace fairness. Around the table, people who had once protected the institution finally understood that protecting its future required confronting its failures. The room remained silent. This time, the silence no longer protected prejudice. It protected the truth. Marcus slowly rose from his chair. No one applauded. No one spoke. The room had expected anger, but all it found was a man, standing. With quiet confidence, he looked around before speaking. "I appreciate everyone who chose to be." Here, his voice was steady. "I know many of you expected something different." Reporter lowered her camera. The board chair nodded. "Please continue, Marcus." Glanced toward the pilot. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone." The pilot remained Silent I came, because what happened wasn't new. A long pause settled over the room. When something happens again and again, silence becomes part of the problem. No one argued. Marcus smiled gently at Maya before continuing. When I was a boy, my father worked nights, cleaning airplanes. The memory softened his expression. He used to come home after midnight, Maya whispered. You told me he never complained. He didn't, Marcus answered. He believed honest work deserved respect, even when people refused to give it. Marcus looked back at the audience. I remember waiting for him outside the hangar. He paused. I asked him why nobody noticed the people who cleaned the planes. A faint smile crossed his face. He told me, son, the people who matter aren't always the people being noticed. Marcus took a slow breath. That night, I made myself a promise. He looked toward the large airline logo displayed behind the board. I would spend my life building something better, not for revenge. A director quietly asked. Marcus shook his head. No, for children. His eyes turned toward Maya. Wanted every child who stepped onto an airplane to believe they belonged before anyone judged them. Without saying a word, Maya reached across the table and gently took her father's hand. The small gesture drew every eye in the room. Marcus squeezed her fingers. This is why today matters. He looked calmly at every executive. Children, remember the moments adults think they'll forget. Silence settled again. Nobody looked away. Nobody needed another explanation. The truth had finally become impossible to ignore. Marcus slowly released Maya's hand, but stayed standing. The silence from the previous moment still held the room like a heavy weight. No one moved. No one tried to interrupt it. He looked toward the board chair. I don't want this to end as just a punishment case. The chair blinked. Then what do you want? Marcus didn't raise his voice. I want change that stays after cameras leave. A few board members exchanged uncertain looks. Marcus continued. From this moment, every employee will go through mandatory bias training, not as a formality, but as lived understanding. A director shifted in his seat. That will take time. It already took too much time not doing it, Marcus replied quietly. The room went still again, he added. There will be an independent complaint office. No internal filtering. No hidden files. A faint murmur moved through the executives. Marcus didn't stop. Every report will be reviewed outside this company, not buried inside it. The pilot lowered his gaze for the first time. Marcus's voice stayed calm. And anonymous reporting systems. So fear doesn't decide who speaks. The board chair finally spoke, and the airline. Marcus turned slightly toward the logo behind them. It earns trust back, not with statements, but with structure. A long pause followed. One executive whispered, "This will change everything." Marcus nodded once. That's the point. He finally looked directly at the pilot again. The room tightened. His voice stayed. Even your greatest mistake was believing dignity depends on appearance. The pilot flinched slightly, but didn't respond. Marcus didn't move closer. He didn't need to. You saw wasn't truth, he continued softly. It was assumption wearing authority. The words hung in the air. No one interrupted even. The reporter stopped breathing for a moment. Marcus stepped back beside Maya again. The atmosphere shifted completely. What had been a hearing now felt like a mirror no one could escape. The pilot looked down, not speaking. And, for the first time, the room didn't look at Marcus for answers. It looked at itself. The room where Marcus spoke was long empty now, but its silence still echoed in memory. Outside the building, life continued as usual. Yet inside that moment, something had permanently shifted. No one left with applause. No one left with victory. Only reflection followed them. The pilot remained seated longer than anyone else. His hands rested on the table, but they no longer carried certainty. The same uniform that once made him untouchable now felt distant, like it belonged to someone he could no longer recognize. He finally stood no. One stopped him. He walked past the board members, past the reporters who had already begun packing their equipment, past the door where authority had once entered with confidence. Now it felt like exit, not power. In the hallway, a junior crew member passed him. The young man hesitated, then offered a small nod. It wasn't disrespectful. It wasn't supportive either. It was neutral. That neutrality hurt more than anger. The pilot gave a faint nod back. But the moment the crew member walked away, he felt something settle inside him. Distance. Not loud rejection, just quiet absence. Down the corridor, he saw a reflection in the glass wall. For a second, he stopped. The face looking back was familiar, but not steady anymore. He whispered to himself, almost without sound, "I thought I was right." No answer came, only the hum of the empty building back in the room. Someone folded a document carefully, as if even paper now required respect. The cameras had gone dark, but the impact had not. The story was no longer about one decision on a flight. It had become a memory the system could not forget, and somewhere in that quiet aftershock, accountability began to exist not as punishment, but as permanence, the kind that does not need witnesses to remain real. The months after the hearing brought no dramatic scenes, no crowds waiting outside his home, and no final moment where someone declared him defeated. Life simply became quieter. The pilot noticed it first in small ways. His phone stopped lighting up as often. Messages that once arrived within minutes remained unanswered for days. Invitations that once filled his calendar slowly disappeared. People who once stood beside him now found reasons to stay away. No judge ordered this, no sentence was announced. The distance came naturally one morning. He sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He opened his phone and scrolled through old conversations, looking for a familiar voice. Nothing, only silence. The hardest part was realizing he could no longer blame the board, the media, or Marcus. The decision on that flight belonged to him. Meanwhile, the airline moved forward. New policies were introduced. Employees spoke more openly. Passengers returned with a different expectation of respect, but the pilot remained connected to that. Christmas morning, he remembered Marcus's calm expression. He remembered the moment. Authority stopped protecting him. For years, he believed power disappeared when someone stronger arrived. He was wrong. Power had disappeared slowly. A coworker choosing distance, a friend refusing to answer, a room no longer defending him. Each small moment removed another layer of the respect he thought he owned. One evening, he looked at his old uniform hanging in the closet. Represented years of achievement, but now it also represented the moment he learned a difficult truth. A title can command attention, a position can create influence, but respect cannot be demanded. It has to be earned, and once lost, it does not return because someone misses having it. The attention eventually faded. The cameras moved on to other stories, and the world that had watched the Christmas flight slowly returned to its daily rhythm. But Marcus never measured the moment by how many people remembered it. The real outcome was found in what happened afterward. One quiet morning, he walked through the airport with Maya beside him. No reporters followed. No announcements were made. He carried the same calm expression he had carried before anyone knew his name. Maya looked around at the busy terminals. "Do people still talk about what happened?" she asked. Marcus smiled softly. "Some do. Most move on." She looked curious. "Does that bother you?" He shook his head. No, the goal was never to be remembered. He looked at the travelers walking past them. The goal was to make things better for the people who come after us. Years later, Maya visited airports where young students received aviation scholarships created through Marcus's foundation. Children stood proudly holding acceptance letters. Wearing the same excitement she once had while carrying her stuffed reindeer onto a plane dot, she watched their faces carefully. Weren't thinking about barriers. They were thinking about possibilities. A young student asked Marcus, "Why did you create this program?" He answered simply, "Because talent should never be stopped by someone else's assumptions." Inside the airline, the changes continued. Employees who once stayed silent began speaking. Complaints that were once ignored received attention. Managers learned that respect was not something written in a policy manual. It was something shown in daily choices. The company did not transform overnight. It changed through small MOMENTSA, supervisor, listening, being treated fairly, a worker feeling safe enough to tell the truth. Marcus knew systems were not repaired by one speech. They were repaired when people chose differently. Every day. And that was the legacy he wanted most, not a headline. Fewer people had to prove they belonged before being welcomed to the changes Marcus hoped for were not measured by announcements or company statements. They appeared in ordinary moments that most people would never notice. A passenger boarding a flight received a warm greeting instead of a suspicious glance. A family asking questions received patience instead of judgment. A traveler who needed help was treated like a person, not a problem. Slowly, people began noticing the difference. They didn't see it because of advertisements or promises. They felt it through small actions repeated every day. Years after the Christmas flight, Marcus and Maya stood near an airport window watching another aircraft prepare for departure. Maya held her father's hand. "Dad." Marcus looked down. "Did we win?" He knew the question carried more than one meaning. It wasn't about the pilot. It wasn't about the company. It was about every moment when someone had been made to feel smaller. Marcus smiled gently. Now Maya looked surprised. He continued, "We simply refuse to lose who we are." She stayed quiet, understanding the lesson behind the words. The victory was never about proving someone else wrong. It was about protecting kindness when anger would have been easier. Looking across the runway, Marcus watched passengers enter the plane without fear or hesitation. Some people were born into comfort. Some inherited opportunities before they ever understood their value, but others built paths where none existed. They created doors for people who had spent years standing outside. They changed systems not because they wanted power, but because they understood the responsibility that came with it. The world would always have moments where judgment appeared before understanding, but every act of fairness created another possibility. Person treated with dignity carried that lesson forward, and the greatest achievement was not owning the seat at the front. It was building a future where everyone believed they had the right to sit there.